Hello, everybody, and welcome to another fantastic session at the Product-Led Festival. We're delighted to have you with us. Now, I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as possible, as always, but just a reminder, questions will be covered at the end, but you don't need to wait until the end in order to submit them. Whenever you think of them, drop them in the chat box, and we will cover as many as possible at the end of the session. Now, do also check out productledalliance.com if you haven't already. I'm sure you've heard me say it, but it really is worth doing. There's loads of resources on there, and you also can get access to our free Slack community that's got 7,500 other PLG pros in there. So do be sure to check that out. On with the session. This one is going to be really, really interesting. We're delighted to have Kate Kaltovich with us. Kate is the head of accessibility innovation at Fable. I'll invite Kate to join me on the stage. And while she does, I'll let you know a little bit about her talk. So we often talk about KPIs. We often think about what to measure, how to measure them. But this session is going to focus on KPIs for accessibility, which I think is going to be a really, really interesting topic. So, Kate, I'll hand straight over to you.
All right. Thanks so much, James. Really excited to talk about KPIs for accessibility, which is something I have been really thinking about for 2 years, and finally decided I'm going to write down what I think and give a talk on it. So let's kick this off. A little bit of background about me first. So I have been in the space of accessibility, thinking about how to make digital products more inclusive for people with disabilities for over 2 decades now. I have some certifications, which all that really means is I took a test to prove that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the technical side of accessibility. And I think what's more important to know is that I have a background as a practitioner. I started my career as a designer and a front-end developer. And so I really learned what accessibility means in the practice of building websites and apps. And I was also in leadership roles in accessibility. So I was the lead at the Ontario Digital Service, which is the equivalent of state government here in Canada. And I was also in a lead position at Canada Post, which would be the equivalent of the United States Postal Services, or wherever in the world you're from, whoever delivers the mail. And I joined a company called Fable in 2020. So Fable is a Toronto-based startup that is looking to make the practice of building websites and apps more inclusive. And I myself have a disability. I've worn hearing aids in both of my ears since I was 6 years old. And typically I will rely on things like captions and transcripts, but I also read lips, and the chat is going to be really helpful for me as well. So before we really dive into it, I want to just level set and make sure we have the same understanding about KPIs. If we don't, this whole talk is wrong. But we'll just assume that is rather similar. A key performance indicator is a critical way of tracking your progress towards some sort of goal or intended result. So in the case of an accessibility KPI, we're trying to have some sort of accessibility goal in mind and track how are we getting to reach that goal. Definitely curious to hear if people have different opinions about KPIs. Do drop that into the chat. Before we really talk about that, I need to make sure everyone has at least a high-level understanding of how a person might test accessibility. So we've got automated tools that are out there, and what they will do, they will run on a website or a native mobile app, and they will check for certain criteria. We have a set of international standards around accessibility that people are supposed to follow in order to make their digital products more inclusive to everyone. So running any number of these automated tools, some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for, some of them will run on a per page basis. Some of them will be crawling an entire website at all times and looking for accessibility issues. Another way that you can test accessibility, which is quite common if you're, working on a rather large website or product, you probably considered having an accessibility audit done, which is where you have an expert come in and they will look at the site and tell you where your issues are. And they might even do some formal documentation for you. In the US, there's something called a VPAT, which is a voluntary product accessibility template, and you fill that out and you end up with an accessibility conformance report, which is an ACR. So that's just a written document that says how accessible your product is or isn't. And then the third way to test accessibility is what we really do at Fable, and it's a focus on user testing. So how do you know if something's accessible to a person with a disability? Well, you get them to use it the same way you would do usability testing with anyone else. And that's what we recommend. There are definitely some challenges with the other two ways of testing accessibility. So for instance, if you're using an automated tool, you don't necessarily get full coverage of all the issues, only what a computer can detect. And if you do an expert review, it's really hard to pull out of that review, of that report, what's the most important thing to tackle and how do we actually tackle this? And so when you use users to find accessibility issues, you really understand the barriers and how severe they are. So this will kind of play into the rest of the talk. Now, a typical KPI is full conformance with what is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. Really awkward acronym. They could have picked a better name for it, but it is what it is. And that's that set of international standards that folks have agreed on. If we follow the standards, a thing is accessible. And it has versions. There was a 1.0, a 2.0. We're currently on 2.1. Looking to launch 2.2 rather soon, and it has different levels of conformance. So level A is the bare minimum of accessibility, double A is pretty good, triple A is really good, and sometimes impossible to achieve. And so what these standards give you is predictability. So I got a picture of a door here, and people generally know how to open a door. It has a thing called a handle. You might turn it, you might, pull it down, you might push it, depending on the type of handle or lever. And that's what standards give us. There's not like random things with doors where you have to push a pedal at the bottom of the door to open it, right? You don't have to figure out each time you come to a door how to open it. So that's what accessibility standards really give you. But there are some challenges with this kind of KPI. So if you're just trying to lead towards a fully accessible product based on standards, well, is that even possible to achieve? Because websites are complex, they're constantly changing. You have all sorts of people and teams working on them. And, you might even have some legacy stuff in there that you can't even change, or you might be pulling in widgets or components or plugins and using them on your website, but you don't control the code. Or you might be using a framework and it might be very difficult for you to implement some things in an accessible way. So if you're in a position where you don't think you can get full conformance, how do you measure your success when it comes to accessibility? And how do you measure progress? If full conformance is like 100% everything being a certain way and accessible, well, what's the metric? Are you, 25% compliant at a certain point of time because 25% of your site fully follows the guidelines? Or is it when you've met 25% of the guidelines? It gets really complicated. And then it completely ignores the idea of usability. So it's entirely possible to have a product that's fully accessible that nobody can use. And that's a problem, because usability is as important as accessibility when it comes to making sure that people can actually get value out of that product. And then there's another issue with these standards, which is objectivity. The only way to really measure against the standard is using a combination of automated tools and maybe some humans who are experts in accessibility. But every standard and every guideline is open to interpretation. They're not completely descriptive in how to test against them. So you could have two different people audit the same site and come up with differences in how accessible they think that site is. And it happens all the time where, a company will get an audit and then they'll work with another company and say, our auditor said that we should be doing this. And the other company will disagree with the way that should be done or how important it is. So it's not really a straightforward way to measure accessibility. So what can we do instead? Well, some alternative KPIs, and I've got 4 of them here, and I'm going to kind of drill down into each one. But the idea being that depending on where your organization is or where you are or your product is in your accessibility journey and what suits your organization best, you would pick some of these KPIs or one of these KPIs, not necessarily all of them. So one of them is a way of measuring the skills that people in your organization have or the training that they've had in accessibility foundation, because you really can't create accessible products if you don't have people who know how to create accessible products. So rather than measuring the product itself, if you measure the capabilities of your team, it's one way of knowing how you're progressing in that journey. And the other is the coverage that you have in accessibility testing on your product. So this could be with automated tools, but I'm more likely to recommend that how many different parts of your product or how many different products, if you have more than one, have been tested by people with disabilities. Another important thing to consider is sharing of accessibility insights. And the reason I consider this to be a critical KPI is because accessibility is such a whole team thing. It's never a one-person job. Even if you have an accessibility team or an accessibility specialist, they alone cannot make this happen. It's everyone coming together. And when you share the insights, you build that awareness, you build that knowledge and that understanding, and you really start to get people on board. And the last one is benchmarking. So if WCAG or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, those standards aren't the best way of measuring, what other different benchmarks of product accessibility could we use? So I'm going to go more into detail on each of these. When it comes to the skills and knowledge of a digital team that's working on digital products, you can look at training completion rate. So assuming you have a program in place for training employees on accessibility, or you've given them access to external training, you can look at how many people have completed that training, and you could set a goal like 90% of people on the team should be completing training within 6 weeks of joining your organization. If you have vendors building products for you, it gets a little more complicated, and then you might want to have KPIs around procurement and understanding the knowledge of the vendors that you use. Another KPI that you could use for your internal team is how much engagement you're seeing with disabled users. And if you have access to a way of testing with people with disabilities, and one of the ways of doing that is with Fable, because that's what we do. We connect companies with people with disabilities to do user testing, or it could be any way. You could do your own recruitment. You could use any other accessibility company that provides that kind of engagement. And so when people start meeting with people with disabilities and observing them using a product, they start to develop this real understanding of accessibility that goes deeper than just a technical sense or just a design sense. So I think it's really important to have that connection. And so setting a goal that, 60% of the team observes at least one user interview is going to really help strengthen that understanding of accessibility and lead to the creation of more accessible products in the end. I myself spent much of my career in accessibility just focused on the standards. And at the point in my career where I actually started meeting other people with disabilities, people who were blind, people who had low vision, people who had mobility issues, and watching them use products, it completely changed the way I thought about accessibility. And I realized how much I had been missing out on. So that's why this is such an important KPI. And then the other thing you can do is ask people about their confidence in their skills. And I mean, confidence isn't the same as competence, but it's something. If you have a team that feels confident in their ability to design and build accessible products, that's saying a lot. And this is something we do in Fable. We have a product called Upskill, which is accessibility training. At the end of every course, we ask people to rate their confidence in going out and applying what they've learned and doing accessibility. And you might set a goal like we have of we want people to at least answer 4 out of 5 on a scale of confidence, with 0 being not confident at all and 5 being extremely confident, so that at least you get a sense of how the team is feeling. When it comes to product coverage, again, my emphasis would be much more on testing with people with disabilities, and they don't even have to be users. There's so much you can learn about accessibility from somebody who isn't a user of your product, because a lot of companies, if you're not building accessible product, you don't have any users with disabilities because they can't use it. So where do you start? You start with paying people for testing or hiring a company to do user testing for you with people with disabilities. So having coverage and having a KPI around how much coverage you have could be an important marker of, understanding your current product's accessibility. So I'm going to give 3 examples here. We might have one company that only has one product, and within that product are 3 really critical user flows. There are 10 critical user flows, and they've tested 3 out of the 10. So maybe that's their current state. And, the KPI is to have all 10 of those critical flows have at least some testing by people with accessibility needs. You might have another company that has 2 products and 40% of one product has been tested. So looking at not just the critical flows, but the entire product and what percentage of it had been tested. And you may have another product that only 10% of it has been tested. And then set goals around the percentage of testing to try to get to 100%. Or you might have a third company where they're focused just on their new features and their new releases, and they've got a forward-thinking approach to accessibility. Maybe it's challenging for them to go back. They might have some legacy software, or just from a budgetary and practicality perspective, they want to just test all of the new features that they're currently building and that they're planning to release either before release, or maybe they're using something like Launch Darkly where you can put certain features out for certain users so that you can test in production. So the goal might be your KPI is that like 80% of all your new features are tested for accessibility. So that's different ways of thinking, how you can structure a KPI to get a good sense of accessibility coverage of your products. Now, back to the sharing insight. One of the things that, and I hate to keep saying Fable, but it's important to give that as an example of how we do that user testing, because we do user interviews and we allow our customer to set up a user interview with somebody who uses assistive technology, and then it's recorded. And we really push people to take that recording and take a small clip of the issues, and not just the bad things, but also the good things. Because I think it's important to say that every product is going to have some good accessibility moments and some bad accessibility moments. For the most part, there could be a product that's completely inaccessible and you can't even get into it. And then we've got work to do, right? But if you take those moments and you share them widely, that's going to really lead to a broader understanding of accessibility, the importance of it, and buy-in for it. So that's an important metric to have. You might take the research that you do with people with disabilities and have a quarterly meeting where you share the findings. You might do lunch and learns, and you might track attendance at those meetings as a KPI to really get a sense of, how broad is the awareness of accessibility within your company. And you might also look at if you're doing things like sprint demos, or you're doing quarterly reports or whatever for executive. How many times are executives getting exposed to accessibility in those scenarios? Because that's so critical for executives to understand where you're at in accessibility, why it's important, what the issues are, is really going to help drive executive buy-in. So let's talk about benchmarking, which was the last KPI I had, and the one I'd like to dive deepest into. I think it's really important to align with whatever your current metrics are. So in every organization that's going to be different, you want to look at what are you measuring when it comes to the user's experience, and then, or even on the engineering side of things, and then have accessibility metrics that are comparable to those. So if I was looking at UX, I might use something like SUS, the System Usability Scale, and there actually is an equivalent metric called the Accessible Usability Scale, which is a 10-question survey that you would administer either automated through your site. When somebody completes something, you might send out an email to users. You might just run a user interview with somebody with a disability and then walk them through the 10 questions at the end of it. And that'll give you a numeric score, which you can look at. Okay, so my SUS score is this, and then my AUS score is that, and how close are they to each other? It's a metric of the user's experience and how good it was. So it's one way of saying, people without disabilities have this experience and people with disabilities have that experience. You could also track something like task completion, which a lot of UX teams do. They want to know, how many people were able to complete a task on the site. And you might do that same kind of task completion with users with disabilities. So you could say something like, 80% of people without disabilities were able to complete this task, which is one of our critical user flows, and only 20% of people with disabilities were able to complete it. So that gives you some metrics, and you can look at, how much, and you can combine that with your product coverage metric to say, here's our product coverage, and within that product coverage, we have an AUS score, we have a task completion score, and start to bring it all together. You could also use NPS, Net Promoter Scores, a ranking of 1 to 10 as to how likely somebody is to recommend a product, and look at, people without disabilities, how likely are they to recommend it versus people with. And you could, bring these into your reports. If you're doing quarterly reports or monthly reports or on a per feature, per product basis, any of the UX research that you're doing, you can have those completion rates, you can have an AUS score, and, just bring those quantifiable things into the conversation. You could do something like a dashboard where you have a table that shows before and after how accessible people felt the experience was. This could be an AUS score, or could be a percentage ranking if you're using a different type of metric. You could ask people how easy they thought it was to complete the experience and give that a percentage. You can look at task completion, combine all of those things. It gives you a really good before and after way of assessing the overall accessibility of a product and task within it, and then clearly showing executives the result. And this only really works if you're doing something in between the before and the after. You want to take the before, do some accessibility improvement, and then do the after. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many people don't actually do that. On the engineering side of things, you could look at the number of backlog tickets for accessibility and set a goal of reducing them by a certain percentage each quarter. You could look at automated accessibility test coverage and see, what percentage of the product has that coverage, and set a goal of increasing it by a certain percentage each quarter. You could also look at regression rates for accessibility bugs. So you really don't want to see a bug that you fixed recurring. And so you can set a target. Generally 10% or less is a good score for regression. You could also look at frequency and severity. So trying to decrease the frequency of a high severity accessibility issue by a certain percentage each quarter. You could set a goal of, if you're not there, if you're not ready to decrease the number of high severity issues, maybe your goal is to actually just give everything a severity rating. So you at least know of all your different issues, which ones are the worst and which ones are not as bad. Or you could also look at, on all of your issues in your backlog, some sort of indication of how widespread they are. For example, sometimes there are accessibility issues that happen in the header or the footer, and that header and footer is repeated throughout the whole site. So there can be quite a reduction in the total number of accessibility issues by just fixing it in the header and the footer versus an issue that appears at random on various pages of the site, and it only affects some users who are on that page. So just different ways of thinking of how to quantify. When it comes to customer experience, you can look at metrics like how long it takes to resolve a complaint and set a goal of resolving an accessibility complaint within a certain number of days, trying to get that. You probably have targets for your resolution of issues overall, so you want to try to get your accessibility target kind of close to your, accessibility target. You could also look at adoption and retention of disabled users. And now you'd want to do this in a pretty non-invasive way. You don't want to be asking all your users if they have a disability, but it can be things like, if you're doing any kind of user surveys, asking them about certain features that they use, like whether or not they use transcript, whether or not they have accessibility needs, or, in a way that's not directly asking them about disability, but gets at that idea that, you have users who benefit from accessibility. And you could also look at the usage of your accessibility related features. So if you have dark mode on your site, I know that a lot of people with low vision do benefit from dark mode and use it. People like myself who have hearing disabilities will benefit from captions. And there might be things around personalization, like increasing the font size or something that gives you some sort of a metric of, how many people are benefiting from the things that aren't directly accessibility related, but definitely could help improve accessibility. So I want to really leave you this idea that KPIs is like a menu, because I've, in the 20 or so minutes I've been talking, I said a lot, and I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. So think of it as a menu. You want to choose an appetizer and a main. And if you're really ambitious or really hungry in this case, maybe you get a dessert as well. It's not about trying to do everything all at once. Accessibility really is a journey. It's an ongoing thing. It's not a thing you do and then you stop doing. It's not a project. It is a way of working. It is inclusive design practices being embedded into the way teams create digital products. So I definitely don't want folk to feel overwhelmed, but to feel that, now you have more choices. Now there's not just one really hard to measure KPI, which is that WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines conformance, but there are other things that you can look at in your practice to help you measure your progress towards building more inclusive products. And with that, I'm going to take a sip of water and open it up for questions and feedback. I'm curious to know if anyone wants to dive deeper into one of the KPIs, or if you have just feedback for me on how feasible they are, or if anything's missing. And James, I'll let you jump in.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kate. I thought that was really, really interesting and really important as well. So I'm sure our audience will have got a lot from that. We have literally got 45 seconds remaining, I think. So I thought maybe you could just answer one of those questions yourself and say, if you could only choose one of those KPIs, which one do you think you would go? I know it's good to have that menu, but if you've just got to choose one, which one do you think would be the most valuable, most impactful?
Definitely exposure to people with disability through user testing. Like, the more people on your team who are building products who have talked to people with disability, the better.
Perfect. I think that's a good thing to take away for everybody and a nice place to end. So I'll say thank you very much again, Kate, and thanks to all our audience. If you do have questions that we didn't have time for, I do apologize for that. Just reach out to Kate, as you can see on there on Twitter or on LinkedIn, or go and connect with Fable as well. But we will move on to the next session. So thank you very much again, Kate.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye, everyone.